presentation, titled Using the Process Approach for Food Safety Auditing, comes to us from Colin Christmas. Colin joined Eagle in 2019 as a managing director to support Eagle's international growth. He's an experienced professional with more than 20 years in the food industry, working for Nestle. Colin has had the privilege to live and work in numerous countries around the world, which helped him develop an excellent understanding for process, systems, and standardization while working with different cultures. He has a bachelor's degree in computing and business analytics from the University of Huddersfield, with specialization in quality control, quality management systems, and business process management. He also has program completion certificates from Wageningen University and the Research for Food Safety Management, and from the London Business School for an Executive Leadership Program. And with that, take it away, Colin.
Thank you very much for the intro, Mike. So as Mike mentioned, I'm talking today about using the process approach for food safety auditing. I'm Colin Christmas, Managing Director at Eagle Certification Group. Okay, so when we talk about the process approach for food safety, we really want to start from the very beginning. So when we understand food manufacturing is actually defined as a process industry. So essentially, this is a production method that creates goods by combining supplies, ingredients, and raw materials using a recipe and a formula. And essentially, why is that really important? Well, it's really important as a food safety auditor that we understand the sectors that we work in. So if you're specialized in food safety and food manufacturing, this is essentially a process manufacturing, a process industry. We look at example sectors, it's food and beverage, it's pharma. It's a process approach, which is all about ingredients. It's about formulas and bulk materials. And as a comparison, there is something called the discrete manufacturing sector. These are very distinct. And it's a different approach. These example sectors are automotive, they're aerospace. This is essentially a product approach. This is about parts. This is about bills and materials. This is about individual units. So as an auditor, we have to really understand the sector that we're working in. And ultimately, now hopefully we're beginning to understand why the process approach is so important in the food manufacturing industry. So here's a quote I like to use, and this is a quote that comes from Steve Olson. He's a United States Department of Agriculture, a USDA inspector, and he says that compliant product has to come from a process to comply. You cannot inspect a product to comply, it has to be produced to comply. So what he's saying here is the emphasis when you look at food safety is really in the process. The problems really come from ingredients, they come from bulk materials, they come from understanding how the recipes are working, and that's where you're going to find your problems. Now, that's not to say that the inspection piece isn't important, it is. You still do inspections at the end of a production line, but the inspections of the product are complemented by understanding your process. When you understand the process flow and an organization has mapped that effectively, then ultimately you're going to have a more robust food safety management system. So what are the common requirements? What is the common requirement for a food safety management system? Well, essentially across all schemes that we see today is food safety processes must be established and compliant and monitored. So emphasis on the word processes there. Why is that important? Well, we need to really understand what a process is. So let's start from the beginning. A process is a set of interrelated or interacting activities which transforms inputs into outputs. This is an ISO 22000 definition. It's also used in the glossary for the GFSI benchmarking requirements. So let's just embrace that concept. It's about inputs and it's about input and it's about outputs. So when we understand that the process approach is inputs and outputs, what is the definition of the process approach? Well, it's essentially a tool for identifying the processes of the organization and their interactions in order to achieve the intended results and to avoid unwarranted results or unwanted results. That's also the ISO 22000 definition of the process approach. So when we understand that, a food safety audit is not only about conformance to individual requirements. Its objective must be to confirm the overall purpose of the system. And this is why the process approach is really important, because this is more broad. This is a process-based approach. And in comparison, what we see with any audit is we have prescription, we have requirements that need to be essentially ticked off. And this is equally important. So to highlight this, a prescriptive approach is also important for food safety. I want to really highlight that checklists are necessary. However, these checklists must be complemented by a process-based approach. So essentially what you see is a good auditor will understand both concepts. You're going to have prescriptive requirements, you need to tick those off, and then ultimately understanding how the process approach complements that is key. And a good auditor will have good questioning techniques to obtain the maximum information from checklists. So process approach, if we want to break it down visually, so when you go into audit an organization, the three areas you must be thinking about when you understand the process approach is food safety management process. That's at the top of the organization. This includes the head of the organization, could be the factory manager if you're auditing a factory. But it's also the leadership team that comes with that management team. This is procurement, planning, logistics, manufacturing, engineering, quality. Who is the head of all of these functions? And that will be regarded as your management process. And then underneath, I think we're more familiar with the realization processes. This is something, the step-by-step approach that we will see in food safety for HACCP and PRPs for prerequisite programs and so forth. And then finally, but equally important, it's to understand as an auditor, does the organization have the right support processes? And support functions could be HR, so who's looking after maybe training records, finance and control, who's approving CapEx for food safety requirements as part of a robust food safety management system, legal, who's looking after regulatory requirements, IT, who's looking after the archiving of information and the technology for the systems that we have to import the data, comms teams, equally important for communicating food safety messages throughout the organization and to internal and external parties in addition to that. And then finally, security. That's really about food fraud. Is the site secure to make food without threat of food fraud, tampering, or exchange of things like ingredients? So they're the three processes, and that's important that you have to have that in your mindset before a process-based audit. So let's look at the management processes. Management processes, so here we see management processes. This includes the food safety policy. What are the food safety objectives? How are those objectives monitored? How are the food safety processes verified? And essentially, how are they improved? This all comes under the management responsibility or leadership of the organization. So here's some good questions. So one thing I find when I look at food safety auditors, there's not so many gaps or observations that's raised against leadership. I think that's a huge opportunity in the food safety space. So I just got some questions here that typically identify some problems within an organization. So here's a question to the leadership. What is the context of your organization? So essentially here you're looking for the organization to be able to explain their risks, their opportunities, and are they associated to interested parties, internal and external issues. So this really is all about the context of the organization, and this is really important that the leadership understand that. Another good question. Who communicates the food safety policy and the key food safety messages to the organization? Who allocates the roles and responsibilities? Well, the clue is in the title. Again, this is leadership. This is not the quality manager or the food safety team leader in the organization. They are not responsible for doing this. You want to see that the head of the organization is the one that's communicating the food safety policy. They are accountable for food safety in the organization. The food safety team leader, the quality manager, is responsible for food safety tasks, but the overall accountability sits at the top of the organization. In addition, roles and responsibilities. We want to see the leadership team taking on roles and responsibilities for food safety requirements across the organization. We want to see the manufacturing operations team owning in-process inspections. We want to see logistics owning the goods inwards process. We want to see engineering owning line repairs. We want to see procurement owning the vendor approval process. And essentially quality have input, food safety have input into those processes, but it's about the leadership that really is allocating those roles, responsibilities, and breaking down functional silos that could impact food safety. And then another key question for leadership: can you explain how the objectives of the food safety management system are linked to business objectives? In a lot of cases, there can be conflicting objectives between business objectives and food safety requirements. This is really key. We have to understand that there's no conflicts between the business objectives. One example could be that the business objective is a huge cost-cutting exercise within operations. This could impact procurement. Procurement then have maybe a 10% reduction in terms of cost in commodities, and food safety have a 10% reduction in terms of food safety or quality related issues. Potentially that's a conflict, because if you have to change your vendors and suppliers and take other cost-cutting objectives, there may be some implications to food safety if there's not investments in the objectives for food safety. And then another question for leadership: what are the expected outcomes of your food safety management system? And this is critical. An organization, as I mentioned before, a process-based approach has to understand the expected outcomes. Outcomes focus is really important. Does the organization understand that? So if the expected outcome is to reduce food safety related incidents, or to reduce food safety recalls, or to reduce regulatory issues, then are they measuring this? There is a knock-on effect when you have that question to an organization: what's your outcome? How are you measuring it? In a lot of cases, I've seen organizations struggle with this type of question, and in a lot of cases, they are not fully measuring the performance of their food safety management system at a high level. And essentially, if they're not measuring it, they cannot manage it. So when we look at outcomes, here's some example KPIs that you want to look at that leadership should be really defining. As I mentioned before, a reduction in food safety recalls and withdrawals, a reduction in issues related to applicable statutory and regulatory food safety requirements. And finally, a reduction in cost of non-quality related food safety requirements. These are the things that we would expect a leadership team to fully map and actually fully measure. Okay, let's move on to realization processes. So with realization processes, these are about the inputs and outputs for intended results. This is the real meat within a food safety management system. This is about operational planning and control. This is about your prerequisite programs, your PRPs. This is about traceability. This is about hazard control. And this is really obviously important, but it's good to understand they're slightly different from management processes and support processes. So let's start with what I think most food safety auditors would be very familiar with. So process flow diagrams. Every single organization is going to have these related to food safety. This is what I would regard as the micro steps. These are intricate step-by-step approach processes that are mapped, and they can go from the raw material to the delivery to the customer. And ultimately, these are used for hazard identification. So when you see these, some good auditor questions, the common ones that I always say is with what, with who, how many. And ultimately, I think we're very familiar and comfortable with interrogating processes related to hazard and hazard identification and hazard. So when you look at that, then the next auditor question is to challenge the organization. How did the organization map, prioritize, and communicate their most important processes? So what we're looking for here as an auditor is, have they adopted a risk-based approach? There are a lot of processes in a food safety management system. They are not treated equally. We have to understand that some have a higher risk than others. So good examples is, does the organization have a risk register? Have they identified their key processes, and have they communicated those key processes throughout the organization? Many organizations refer these to their must-win battles. So Once we understand what are the key processes or the highest priority processes in an organization, the opportunity is how well have the organization mapped those processes? Have they visualized them? They may only have mapped their processes related to the HACCP diagrams, process flows, as I mentioned before. Have they gone above and beyond? And one example that I'm familiar with, and I've seen many times in organizations that I've audited or been a part of, is turtle diagrams. Very useful for realization processes. So when we look at the processes, this is the process approach. We see the inputs and the outputs. But then how do you interrogate that? How do you map that? So let's look at the how. What are the instructions? What are the procedures? What are the methods? They are typically multiple instructions, procedures, and methods associated to a process. So you're bringing all those together. You're not auditing procedures. You're auditing the process. Then, as I mentioned before, how many? What is the performance indicators? How well are they being managed? Are they being managed effectively? And are there enough actions that's coming out of the measurement processes that they have mapped? With who? When you look at the process, so who's assigned to the process? Who's been trained? What's their knowledge? What's their skills? This is the roles and responsibilities. As I mentioned before, the leadership have to map these roles and responsibilities. And then finally, with what? What are the equipments? What are the materials, ingredients, bulk materials that's associated to that process? And then ultimately, how well do they link in a process flow? So the output of this process has to connect with the input of the next process. And ultimately, this is critical that an auditor understands that linkage and understands that the organization has understood that their output is important as an input to the next step in the organization. So let's look at an example. I've given an example here for the pathogen management processes. So this is an example where within pathogen management, we have different, what we could regard as process steps. It could be regarded as sub-processes. So essentially, if you're looking at your overall pathogen management process, has an organization done this? Do they understand this concept that the pathogen management program is a group of processes and sub-processes? And here we see that there is a ready-to-eat process. There are GMPs that's required. Controlled floor conditions for zoning is required. Sanitary design of equipment and facilities is required. Sanitation procedures and controls. And finally, environmental monitoring. And when you look at these processes, who's responsible for what? It is typically different functions. And this is what roles and responsibilities are the key part that they have to play. This is not all the responsibility and accountability of the food safety team leader. And then when we look at those processes, a similar approach to turtle diagrams is something called SIPOC. And this is a mapping process again. You have the supplier, input, process, output, customer. And this pathogen process, I put it into a SIPOC diagram. Here are the process steps or sub-processes, ready to eat, GMPs, floor conditions, sanitary design, sanitization, and environmental monitoring. When an organization visualizes this in such a way, it makes life easier for the auditor, but it also really helps the organization because they can visualize their process and then they can ask the same questions as an auditor can. So who is responsible for the input? What is the input? And what documents are required for that input? What is the process step? What is the output? What are the things, documents that will come out of that process? And who is responsible and ultimately accountable for that receipt of that information? And then ultimately, what are they doing with that information? And are they happy with that output? That's a simple question to ask. A recipient of an output is are they happy? Is this the right output for your requirements? And so ultimately, that's a good way of visualizing things. From an audit approach as a food safety auditor, it sounds back to front, but with process-based auditing, when you look at processes, and if you do see these diagrams, you start with the output first. You start with the output first and work your way backwards. And then ultimately, these are good tools to know about. It may be that an organization fully meets requirements of a standard that you're auditing against. So it may not be an observation that leads to a non-conformity, but it could be an observation that leads to an opportunity for improvement. So if you're not seeing this visualization, if you're not familiar with this as a food safety auditor, I recommend you learn the process and understand it a little bit more, and then mention that as an opportunity to the organizations that you're auditing. And then finally, let's look at support processes. So support processes, these are about how the functions work and support the food safety management system. They include HR, finance control, legal, comms, information technology, and site security. These are very, very important to an organization. And ultimately, when you're auditing, I would say pay a lot of attention to support processes. Don't ignore these processes. In a lot of cases with finance control, is the right CapEx allocated? I've seen very poor record control in an organization related to training records. And is that an opportunity for HR to centralize that process, to own the training records? Maybe, maybe not. But we want to see these organizations fully understanding what their obligations are to the food safety management system. Again, if these organizations are not supporting the food safety management system, guess what happens? Typically, the quality manager or the food safety team leader ends up being the record control expert, ends up being the person that fully understands all of the legal requirements, is the person that's doing all of the communications for key food safety messages, is the person that's sometimes I've seen a food safety team leader being so desperate they go away and create an access database because they don't have the right technology to support them for some of their food safety record control or data collection. And then ultimately site security. Is the site security really doing its job to make sure that in terms of food defense, food fraud, that people do not have access to the site and people are not tampering with key ingredients or product in that organization? So it's a really important thing as a food safety auditor. And again, highlight this: if everything is being done by the food safety team leader or the quality manager, for me, that is not the process approach. That needs to be an observation, and it needs to be clearly documented that the organization may have implemented food safety in a silo, and that's something we cannot accept in a process-based approach for food safety. And then, once we understand the processes, so the auditor must take the time to understand what is required from the process they are auditing. It's very easy just to start looking at the procedures and forms and checklists as individual things within a function. That would be regarded as a procedure-based audit. That could be a product-based audit. So essentially, understand the process, understand where all of the inputs and outputs are involved, and then collect all of the information that supports that process. And that is your process flow. And then ultimately, the objective is to make sure that process is controlled effectively, not just the procedure. And when we understand the processes that are mapped, what other tools and techniques can help us? As an auditor, plan, do, check, act. If you're a food safety auditor today and you are not adopting a PDCA methodology, I would say then you are not auditing to a process-based approach. So this is a tool that's used by auditors. It's a questioning technique to obtain maximum information about a process and ultimately determine conformance and improvement to the requirements of the food safety management system. So with PDCA questions, how can they be applied? Well, essentially they can be applied to the organizational level. And this is about the food safety management process. So we want to understand what that is. And then the second thing is the operational level. So this is the realization processes. This is the support processes. So keep that in your mindset is, am I auditing at organizational level or am I auditing at operational level? And once you have that in mind, the auditor must go in with this mindset. I'm looking at the processes. Have they been analyzed? Have they been monitored? Have they been measured? Have they been improved? That is your mantra when you're questioning process owners, management teams, leadership, operational teams in your organization. That is your 4-step process to fully understanding whether they are doing that process. And then PDCA questions. So we see plan, do, check, act. What really are the PDCA questions? And these are examples from the ISO 9001 Audit Practices Group. This is quality, but they can be easily adapted for food safety. And ultimately, I have had the pleasure of witnessing many auditors over the last 10 years, and the best auditors have a technique where they use PDCA questions. They start with plan questions, do questions, check questions, act questions, and they identify strengths and weaknesses in that process because of that technique. As I mentioned here, these are standard questions. They can be adapted compared to the process you're audited. So for example, pathogen management, you may have slightly different questions, but they should still be grouped into a PDCA format. And then once you understand that these questions can be structured for a broad range of food safety failures, this is going to be your ticket to really understanding whether the organization is going to have some problems. So the key examples I've seen for problems in food safety in my time auditing and witnessing auditors, and for seeing food safety failures in organizations. These are the ones that pop up all the time. What happened? What's the root cause? Well, there was miscommunication. There was conflicting priorities. There was a lack of awareness. There was a lack of competencies. So these are the things that will pop out when you adopt the PDCA approach to questioning during your audit, food safety audit. These will not be identified typically if you have a checklist approach only. So this is why I mentioned before, checklists need to be complemented with the process approach, PDCA type questions. You will find that typically if you're auditing a process or a process step, so let's go back to pathogen management, the P may be very strong, the plan part of the organization of that process. The execution part may be very strong, and it may be that there's a weakness with the check and they're strong at the act. Typically, what I will see is 1 out of 4 of those will be a weakness. And it varies from the function you're auditing or the process you're auditing, but it's key that that is identified and observations are written up. So when we look for observations, auditors are looking for conformance against the standard. As an auditor, that's our goal. In a process-based audit, the auditor must also determine uniformity of output. Now, if there's one key takeaway today from auditors watching this presentation, uniformity of output. This is really about understanding the definition of the integration of interdependent processes. Is the uniformity of output, are those outputs consistent? Are those outputs what the recipient of that output, the receiver, is really looking for? And is there any inconsistencies there? And typically that's where your failures will lie. The inputs and outputs, those touch points, the uniformity piece is where you would typically have a failure. That's where organizations will have problems. If you look at it as a checklist in a procedure, then those processes, that procedure may be robust. It's the touch points that typically have the problems. And then when you understand uniformity of output, essentially for an auditor, this is all about audit trails. And audit trails, this is a systematic approach to collecting evidence based on scientific samples or specific samples where the output of a series of interrelated processes meets expected outcomes. So essentially what this really means is when you're auditing, you need to stick to the audit trail. I've seen auditors come into a factory that's making a confectionery product, and they purchase that product from a grocery store on the way into the audit, and they put it on the table in the opening meeting and say, I'm going to adopt the process approach, and it's going to be all about this product I purchased today. And it's quite fascinating because they will, from that finished product, they will go all the way back to the ingredients. They will look at the ingredients that was associated to making that product. They will look at the processing steps. They will look at everything systematically that was associated to that one product. And even the traceability exercise will be associated to that product they'll put on the table. And some of those processes will take you to third shift. So they will come in at 2 o'clock in the morning and speak to the operators that were part of the production for that product. And ultimately that is where the systematic collection of specific samples comes to. And then, did it meet the expected outcome for the organization, for the customer, for the consumer? And here the starting point is identifying the process path and the controls that were applied. Then select the different samples. So essentially here, the samples must not be taken at different stages of the process if they are related to the process path. An auditor must be able to verify that the process has delivered the intended result. And here the process approach has an overall focus on risk-based thinking. So essentially this is aimed at taking advantage of the opportunities and preventing undesirable results. So what we're talking about here is risk-based thinking must be demonstrated by the organization, and risk-based thinking must be observed by the auditor. And this is essential for achieving an effective food safety management system. So again, we have two levels. When we look at risk-based thinking, we want to look at organizational level, which is the food safety management processes. And we need to look at the operational level, which is the realization processes. And these are the support processes. So as an auditor, I want you to keep that in mind. What are you looking at in terms of risk? Is it the organization or is it the operation? So those are the two distinct levels. And what do I mean by that? So here we see food safety auditing at the operational level this is all about hazard assessment. And this is hazard control plan. This is where actions are taken to minimize risk with negative results. So that's something I think we're very familiar with as food safety auditors. And then something that we're not as familiar with and not as observant with in some cases is auditing organizational risk. So this time, this is the effect of uncertainty. And organizational risk can actually have positive and negative consequences, but equally both are important. So when we look at organizational risk, what is the objective evidence? We want to see if the organization has done a SWOT analysis. What kind of supplier feedback do they have? What kind of customer feedback do they have? Have they looked at regulatory? And have they looked at competitor analysis? So here the auditor observations can be related to whether these processes are applied in management processes. So here we want to look, have they done strategic planning? What are their operational reviews are looking like? What are their corrective actions related to the organization? What is the management team really doing associated to organizational risk? And as an auditor, request these documents, spend time understanding that and seeing if they really have applied a risk-based approach. And then finally, what are the process-based audit conclusions? Did the organization implement a system that works for them and not a system that the organization has to work for? So this is very common. Ultimately, you want to see whether an organization fully has adopted the process approach. Then in many cases, that system will work for them. If they're trying to implement a system that's outside of their typical management processes and how they operate, it's going to be a very painful system. And you will hear complaints, and typically you will see that during the auditing process that the system is very heavy for the organization to work with. As I mentioned before, uniformity of output. Is that really working for an organization? Have they effectively mapped their inputs and outputs throughout their organization? As I mentioned before, you'll see problems associated here with miscommunication, lack of awareness with food safety objectives. So has there been awareness of food safety objectives at all levels? That is another indication that the food safety system may have been implemented as a silo, and it's completely owned by the food safety team. That's not going to work with a process-based approach. And then finally, did the organization meet the objective to continuously improve the effectiveness of the food safety management system? This is a good example where the conformance and compliance of an organization of a food safety management system is enough, and it's not always the case. So here is a good example. We see here halfway up the diagram, conformance and compliance. This may get an organization to a point where they have mapped all of the requirements. They are conforming to all of those requirements in an audit, but there still may be food safety failures. A lot of food safety failures happen after conformance and compliance because of the continuous improvement piece is not fully applied or embraced by the organization. The closer you get to efficiency and effectiveness, the less likely you're going to have failures related to food safety in your organization. So that's key. When as an auditor, in your mindset, has the organization adopted a conformance compliance mindset? Could be a checklist approach, a procedure-based approach that may get conformance to a standard, but is it truly enough? So the key takeaway today, so hopefully the food safety auditors that are watching this presentation today, my question to you is, are you using the process-based approach? Are you using the supporting tools that's been discussed today to audit food safety management systems? And the challenge is, if not, what's your action plan to address this? This is critical. This is really key. This is something that you should have in your toolbox in terms of understanding how to perform an audit. And some of these techniques will identify strengths and weaknesses within an organization's food safety management system. So with that, as I mentioned before, I'm Colin Christmas. I'm happy to receive any emails for any questions for the presentation you've received today, and I appreciate your time for watching this presentation.
Thank you, Colin Christmas, for that look at the process approach to food safety auditing. And that concludes this presentation.